you so much. And thanks to the Africana Studies program, Women and Gender Studies, and the Department of Philosophy and Religion for having me. Thanks so much for Ed for all of his diligence and care in organizing this. And yeah, this is so great. This is a part of a larger project. This is sort of a little sort of introduction to the book manuscript that I'm writing right now. So I look forward to the conversation that we will have very soon. So to get started, yeah, this is called Let Rosa Be the One. On March 2nd, 1955, Claudette Colvin, a 15-year-old black woman in Montgomery, Alabama, rode the city bus home from school. When the bus driver told her to give up her seat for a middle-aged white woman, despite the empty seats beside and behind her, Colvin refused. She was then arrested, handcuffed, kicked, and dragged off the bus by Montgomery police, who, according to reports, passed the time they spent booking her, guessing her bra size, referring to her as a thing and a whore. She was charged with violating the segregation law, disorderly conduct, and assault. Local leadership of the Women's Political Council and the NAACP, including, pictured here, Edie Nixon and Joanne Robinson, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was to arrive later at Nixon's request, and including Rosa Parks, had been looking for an opportunity both to legally challenge bus segregation in Montgomery and to organize a boycott of the bus system. 9 months later, on December 1st, 1955, or later on that week, they chose to rally a boycott around the arrest of Rosa Parks rather than Claudette Colvin. NAACP activists at the time were concerned about Colvin's youth, her outspokenness, her poverty, and her fierceness. Their concerns were solidified when, after her arrest, Colvin wore her hair in cornrows and discovered that she was pregnant by an older married man. Or as apparently her mother said at the time, Claudette took a tumble. Rosa Parks, on the other hand, represented a model of feminine middle-class respectability. In her memoir of the struggle, Joanne Robinson described Parks as, quote, a medium-sized, cultured mulatto woman, a civic and religious worker, quiet, unassuming, and pleasant in manner and appearance, dignified and reserved, of high morals and a strong character. All right, so here's where we get more philosophical. My talk today returns us to this well-known yet not well-known moment in the civil rights movement in the United States. I turn to the choice of Parks over Colvin as a paradigmatic instance of how the logic of exclusion, as well as contestations of exclusion, function simultaneously, multiply, and constitutively. What the case of Parks and Colvin in particular shows us is how, what the case of Parks and Colvin shows us in particular is how exclusion operates in multiple ways at the same time. And I argue that this exclusion renders both Colvin and Parks as unintelligible political agents, or they are unintelligible as political agents, though in slightly different ways. While Parks and Colvin are unintelligible as political agents for different reasons, I will argue that they are both unintelligible because of their exclusion within the political body of the United States rather than merely from the political body of the United States. This means that they are also excluded from the idea of political agency that political body produces, and that this is the reason it is so difficult to see Colvin's unruliness as an insurgency or Parks' disobedience as carefully strategic. And I argue that this unintelligibility does real work in constituting political bodies and political agency. I explain this through the concept of constitutive exclusion, and here's what is at stake in that concept. Constitutive exclusion helps us think about age, race, class, gender, sexuality, disability, and what Judith Butler calls the embarrassed, etc., all together. It helps us better understand how these identities constitute each other and how they are reinscribed over time. In this sense, constitutive exclusion is closely related to intersectionality. But whereas intersectionality's dominant metaphor is spatial, Constitutive exclusion adds the dimension of time, articulating the historical sedimentation of these identities. So it can show us how the histories of multiple exclusions and strategic choices built upon each other, layer by layer, are shaping the ground of politics upon which we presently stand, but to which we are usually blind. In the case of the Montgomery Bus Boycott, the choice of Parks over Colvin indicates a choice to leverage Parks's feminine middle-class respectability in order to contest the exclusion of Blackness. Constitutive exclusion gives us not just a way of getting the history here correct, but it also demands that we attend to the further exclusions hidden behind these choices so as to better understand who we are now for the sake of a future which is no longer based on the fantasy of unity and the sacrifice of difference. So in my time today, I will first return to the description of this particular case, emphasizing how the choice of Parks over Colvin did not only exclude Colvin for the sake of a more strategic and respectable actor, but that this choice also included our ability to see Parks as a political agent in her own right. Following the details of the case, I will give a more theoretical account of how I understand and use the concept of constitutive exclusion in general. I then want to mark the way that constitutive exclusion builds on theories of feminist epistemology, noting how difference shapes the way we know who is and who is not, or who counts as and who does not count as a political agent. With this in mind, I will again return to the case to argue that it can be productively read as an instance of constitutive exclusion, and with the help of the work of feminist political theorist Holloway Sparks down at Emory, trace out what the case implies for the concept. And then if at the end, maybe if I have a little bit more time, I'll trace out the larger implications of this for my research project. Okay, so first, back to the case. While Colvin and 4 other women were party to the lawsuit Browder v. Gale that ended de jure segregation of the Montgomery bus system, Colvin was not chosen as the figurehead for the boycott. Neither were the other plaintiffs in the Browder case, including both 36-year-old Aurelia Browder herself, who was arrested in April of 1955, and 18-year-old Mary Louise Smith, who was arrested in October of 1955, all for the same crime. Parks's refusal to relinquish her seat on that day has been cast not as a strategic decision of a savvy political actor, but as a simple act in which a dignified middle-class woman chose to remain seated because she was tired from a long day at work. This historical, or perhaps rather mythological narrative since the boycott has reinforced this version of events. For example, in his 1993 history, The Struggle for Black Equality, which is a text routinely assigned in high school history courses and college history courses, Harvard Sitkoff writes, quote, "Mrs. Rosa Parks said no, her feet hurt, weary after her long hard day, she wanted to remain seated for the rest of her ride." At the concert celebrating the first inauguration of President Barack Obama in 2009, actor Samuel L. Jackson recalled Parks's role in the civil rights struggle. Quote, "There have been many foot soldiers in the quest for justice. One was an Alabama department store seamstress. In 1955, tired from her long day at work, she brought that distant hope one step closer by the simple act of refusing to move to the back of the bus." Just as an aside, in her really incredible biography of Parks, Jean Theoharis calls this national icon the Madonna of Montgomery. This is what Rosa Parks has become, sort of the national narrative. She points out that hers is the third biography of Rosa Parks, only the third biography of such an important figure in the civil rights movement, and the only one not written for children. And just last week, after a 10-year, or much longer than 10 years, I guess only 10 years or so since her death, just after there was a legal battle over Parks's papers, and that legal battle was resolved for a while anyway. Her papers are now at the Library of Congress and are being worked on and archived. So there's much more to be known about Rosa Parks, hopefully very soon. In contrast to this national hagiography, In her detailed and moving history at the dark end of the street, Black women, rape, and resistance, Danielle Mcguire gives a far richer account of Rosa Parks' political education in the struggle against sexual violence against Black women across the South from the 1940s and the 1950s. Parks' history as a political activist and organizer, and later as a Black nationalist, were suppressed and ignored at the same time that her iconic place in history was secured. Claudette Colvin, young, poor, angry, and just as much a victim of the violence and degradation of Jim Crow, on the other hand, hardly appears in the story of the struggle for Black civil rights in the US at all. Colvin's story only came to light in the years following the death of Rosa Parks. In an interview with the New York Times, she said, quote, "My mother told me to be quiet about what I did. She told me, let Rosa be the one. White people aren't going to bother Rosa. Her skin is lighter than yours, and they like her." While the organizers of the Montgomery Bus Boycott, including Parks herself, were smart political actors, the historical narrative we have inherited of Parks and Colvin's functions to occlude this fact on either side of the decision of Parks over Colvin. I argue that this is because they are constitutively excluded from the terms of intelligible political agency. That is, on the one hand, we have for the most part forgotten Claudette Colvin's role in this pivotal moment in history, and on the other hand, we remember and understand Parks less as a political agent than a political object, as a simple private woman who became political because of ordinary and personal reasons. I claim that even in the contestation of one form of exclusion, that of Black Americans from equality in public life, Colvin herself is constitutively excluded as part of that contestation. And also at the same time, our ability to read either Colvin or Parks as political agents is occluded as part of that same structure and process. Though in different ways, this structure, this process, renders both unintelligible as political agents. I argue that this distinction between intelligible and unintelligible political agency is determined through constitutive exclusion. Constitutive exclusion describes both a structure and a process by which a system of thought, a symbolic order, or a political body is defined through the exclusion of some difference that is intolerable to it and against which it defines or constitutes itself. That is, a unity or an identity is created not by actually removing the differences that challenge or question that unity, but in fact by keeping those distances close to hand, though that difference is then repressed or invisible to the body that excludes it. The excluded difference thus remains within the body that has excluded it, and it continues to do the work of defining that body through its internal exclusion. At the same time, the remaining within of that excluded difference must be covered over, repressed, or disavowed. So the move here, the theoretical move here is twofold. First, a system of thought, symbolic order, or political body constitutes itself with the production of an excluded element that it continues to harbor within itself. Second, this internal harboring of the excluded element is repressed or disavowed. Constitutive exclusion therefore produces a remainder. This remaindered figure, produced in and through constitutive exclusion, is therefore both the condition of possibility and the condition of impossibility of the bordered, delimited space drawn through that exclusion. It is the condition of possibility in that the coherence of the body in question relies on that excluded figure to exist, and it is the condition of impossibility insofar as its remaining within that body continues to pose a threat to that body's existence. The figure then, this constitutively excluded figure, can only appear insofar as it does appear as a problem or as a kind of insurrection from within. It is in this precise sense, then, that these figures simultaneously ground and trouble the distinctions upon which political agency relies. For instance, the distinction between public and private. The exclusion of these remaindered figures from political agency grounds these distinctions, but their inclusion, nevertheless within that political body, poses a problem to these distinctions that then has to be managed. In general, I've developed this concept of constitutive exclusion in order to better understand the construction of political agency. I argue that, on the one hand, constitutive exclusion establishes political bodies and secures the agency of political subjects. On the other hand, constitutive exclusion makes any such secure establishment, either of political bodies or political agencies, ultimately impossible. The difference between these two is repression or disavowal, a not seeing or a not knowing built into the very definition of the political body or the concept of political agency. This is what makes, I claim, constitutive exclusion a fundamentally epistemological problem. Given that it is knowledge about political membership and agency that is at question here, constitutive exclusion poses what I call a political epistemological problem. The language of political epistemology points to kind of a theoretical upgrade of recent work, recently developed theories in feminist philosophy that focus on social epistemology. Social epistemologists argue that knowledge is socially situated, but by emphasizing the political rather than the social aspect, my approach is informed by feminist and queer theory in that it takes up gender as a political system and thus treats political agency as gendered. And it's informed by critical philosophies of race that take up white supremacy as a political system and so takes political agency as raced. As I said, my work is most concerned with understanding how constitutive exclusion structures political agency. I claim that this allows us to ask a new set of questions, such as, if one is rendered unintelligible as a political agent, then what is the function or the use of that unintelligibility for politics? How is our understanding of who we are structured by what we do not and cannot see, hear, or understand? What kinds of claims are we constituted not to hear? What does that unintelligibility look like? Or how does that unintelligibility appear, insofar as it ever does appear, within the delimited space of intelligible political agency? And how does one contest one's constitutive exclusion? How do you translate yourself across that border? How do you move from being unintelligible to intelligible as a political agent? How does one make a claim in a language that has defined itself on the very impossibility of that claim being heard or understood? And what are the risks and effects of that translation? Since constitutively excluded figures are unintelligible politically, any contestations of those exclusions they might make will appear to those on the inside as wild, strange, threatening, destructive, or even mad. Translating the claims of these figures is therefore very difficult. Rather than simple inclusion on the terms as already established, translation, or successful retranslation, I would say, necessitates the reconstitution of the political body itself. That is, since the terms of political agency are drawn on the exclusion of these figures, then any successful contestation of constitutive exclusion must lead to a new constitution on new terms. Simple inclusion would mean assimilation to already established terms. So in my larger project, in the book manuscript, I pursue this concept in several directions. First, I explore the specific negativity at work in constitutive exclusion, in particular how the distinction between a pure inside and a pure outside produces an excessive multiple negativity that subtends this distinction that is excluded but remains within. And I use Hegel's science of logic to do some of that work. Second, I explore the epistemology at work in constitutive exclusion, in specific, how the excluded can be included, or how this outside can be inside, only through an epistemology of ignorance, right, or a blind spot in our self-knowledge. Third, I pursue constitutive exclusion as a matter for materialist history by thinking through how these remainders are sedimented in our history and how to unearth them. And fourth, I work through several instances of the contestation of constitutive exclusion, or several different cases, to understand the politics of constitutive exclusion, and more importantly, how this concept determines who cannot be intelligible as a political agent, and what this unintelligibility does for political bodies, as well as the concept of political agency. Taken together, these directions drive my larger argument. If we want to understand how another world is possible, then we need to remember how it could already have been otherwise. We must therefore unearth these constitutively excluded figures sedimented in our history to show us who we are by means of who we have excluded, who we've simplified or misunderstood or silenced or forgotten. We can learn how to be otherwise from the models of contestation that they have offered, but which we have not yet been able to hear. So what does our concept of constitutive exclusion here offer for our understanding of the case with which I opened? Our understanding of the choice to organize the Montgomery Bus Boycott around Rosa Parks rather than Claudette Colvin. Perhaps more importantly, how do these two women inform the concept of constitutive exclusion, right? So I see there's a sort of reciprocity here between the empirical case and the theoretical framework. Feminist political theorist Holloway Sparks argues that the choice to organize the Montgomery Bus Boycott around Parks rather than Colvin is an example of what she calls strategic straightness. Straightness is a strategy that citizens use in their struggle for standing, or a strategy to contest their exclusion. Strategic straightness contests the exclusion of one identity category by playing to or playing up other identity categories. That is, one contests one's exclusion on the basis of sexuality, for instance, by playing to one's inclusion on the basis of class or race. And so this happens, or it has happened in the city of Chicago. There is a really fantastic center for queer youth called the Center on Halsted, which is located in Boys Town, the gay neighborhood in Chicago. And it's a center for all queer youth all over the city of Chicago. But there were a lot of gay men in the neighborhood who were upstanding white property owners who were really upset that all of these black kids were coming into the neighborhood and causing a bunch of crime, right? Even though they themselves were queer youth who were using the youth programs at this center, and they were maybe in danger of being bashed in their own neighborhoods. And so they came to the Center on Halsted to be, to not have to face that kind of violence. They were then facing another kind of violence from the very people who were supposed to be including them and teaching them and stuff. So that's another way that this works out. Holloway Sparks argues that strategic straightness was deployed in the Montgomery Bus Boycott to counter the segregation of Black Americans in Montgomery by relying on the figure of Parks rather than that of Colvin. In doing this, the boycott organizers portrayed themselves as respectable, hardworking, middle-class Americans. In later actions, civil rights leaders chose to portray themselves as loyal Americans by situating themselves as heterosexual and anti-communist. This was performed in the choice to de-emphasize the role of Bayard Rustin in the March on Washington, denying him time at the podium because Rustin was an out gay man and at one time a member of the Communist Party. He was also a Quaker, though I don't know if that was if that's reason to consider him kind of an embarrassment. Might be a little bit inconvenient for the larger narrative going on at the podium. Strategic straightness is a way of explaining the contestation of exclusions based on race, for instance, by playing to and therefore reproducing exclusions based on class, gender, or sexuality. While the organizers of the Montgomery Bus Boycott successfully contested the constitutive exclusion of citizens based on race, leading to the reconstitution of the United States as a political body. That's a slightly debatable point. Political theorist Danielle Allen claims that the civil rights movement was actually a reconstitution of the United States on new terms, which is evidenced by the evidenced by the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So this led to the reconstitution of the United States as a political body, but through the reinscription of other exclusions based on gender, class, and sexuality. The reinforcement of these other exclusions then may have made it harder for later citizens to contest those exclusions, as Parks argues was the case in the United States' welfare rights movement in the 1960s and 1970s. It also left plenty of room for the exclusion of Blackness outside the frame of middle-class respectability and beyond the immediate politics of desegregation. I think that's a pretty uncontestable claim since August of last year, especially. Sparks' account of strategic straightness is most useful for my purposes in understanding the structure and operation of constitutive exclusion at work in the model of contestation provided by Colvin and Parks. Specifically, it is useful as an account of how folks cast into the position of constitutive exclusion can contest their exclusion and make themselves intelligible to a body that has constituted itself on the basis of rendering them politically unintelligible, right? Strategic straightness then teaches us that these exclusions and these constitutions function multiply. Insofar as strategic straightness relies upon the ability of excluded persons to portray themselves as straight while abjecting, disavowing, or dissociating themselves from those seen as non-normal or threatening, this indicates the multiplicity of constitutive exclusion, right? So what this means is that political bodies are constituted through multiple exclusions. And those who are excluded are never purely excluded. They stand both within and without, subjects as multiply constituted as the political bodies that they occupy and haunt. The political present is therefore sedimented with the history of these multiple exclusions, indicating that political agency and intelligibility are never entirely closed nor fully delimited. The multiplicity of constitutive exclusion thus indicates that it does not ultimately work. It never pulls off that exclusion absolutely, and the Constitution is never final. Instead, as Judith Butler argues, the norm or the frame usually, or perhaps always, produces the shadow of its failure. Though I hesitate to follow Butler in claiming that this always happens. However, since part of the task of critiquing constitutive exclusion, as I see it, is its denaturalization or its denormalization, for the sake of imagining a world in which constitutive exclusion no longer defines who we are or how we understand who we are. So let me briefly summarize what the choice to organize the Montgomery Bus Boycott around Parks rather than Colvin tells us about constitutive exclusion. First, it tells us that constitutive exclusion functions multiply, right? Because Parks was able to effectively leverage gender, sexuality, and class in her contestation of the exclusion of Black folks in Montgomery, this tells us that both the body whose borders are drawn by constitutive exclusion and that those who are cast in the position of that exclusion are multiple. So we have multiple identity on the inside and multiple identity on the outside. But then, if the inside and the outside are both multiple, what can the difference between an insider and an outsider be? Given that the choice of Parks over Colvin was a smart political strategy with all of the risk of failure that any political choice entails, we can say that while the outside is multiple, the inside is blind to that multiplicity and persists in its fantasy of oneness. Second, where that multiplicity is not read as wildness, unruliness, or something excessive and threatening, as it was in the case of Colvin, it is reified as something apolitical, as it was in the case of Parks. That is, the very qualities that made Parks' contestation of her exclusion a success, that very feminine middle-class respectability, rendered her in the national memory a middle-aged woman who didn't want to give up her seat because her feet were tired from working all day. The threat that Parks might have posed in the unruliness of the excluded was thus managed by rendering her just a, tired middle-aged woman, which she always resented. She was like, I was only 41. Like, was not fair at all. All right. Third, these 2 points reveal something important about the function of intelligibility in the construction of political agency in the United States. The structure and operation of constitutive exclusion has itself served to blind us to the strategy at work in the Montgomery Bus Boycott, and I think maybe in the civil rights movement as a whole. This is also due to the multiple exclusions at work in this model. That is, in choosing Parks over Colvin, the boycott organizers, including Parks herself, right? Let's not forget that she was secretary of the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP for many years. The organizers leveraged Parks' middle-class, Black, feminine respectability in order to strategically contest the constitutive exclusion of Black people as a whole. But because this very middle-class black feminine respectability is itself seen as apolitical or pre-political, that made it different to see this choice as strategic, or it occluded our ability to see it, to identify it as a political strategy. The narrative of Parks as simply a woman tired from a long day at work made a matter of necessity out of a strategic choice, itself risky and contingent. That there was a strategic choice between Colvin and Parks gets covered over in the reconstitution in this instance. And this is itself, I claim, due to the work of constitutive exclusion, which, because it functions retrospectively, regularly turns the contingent character of a political decision into what seems like a fait accompli. So in this vein, we should remember that this model of contesting constitutive exclusion is just one model among others. That strategic straightness was employed in this case does not indicate that it is the only way, or maybe even the best way, of contesting constitutive exclusion, or of doing the work of translation from political unintelligibility into political intelligibility. The critique of constitutive exclusion, especially as a historical critique, demands that we attend to the multiple ways in which this is done, in order to respond to the particular construction of political agency at any given moment, or the particular exclusions that structure that agency. This ambivalence of constitutive exclusion as both a structure and a process, however, calls us as well to pay attention to the risks involved in any contestation of constitutive exclusion. Take for example the figure of Antigone in Sophocles' famous tragedy and in the modern retellings of that tale after Hegel. In her contestation of her uncle Creon's sovereign authority, she risked being overcome by the very language of sovereignty that she had to employ in her contestation of constitutive exclusion, even as she perverted that language and bent it to her own purposes. Likewise, Parks and other organizers of the boycott risk being overcome by the very terms of political agency that they are contesting. So they made a strategic choice to challenge some of the terms of political agency while reinscribing others. This then led to the exclusion of the figure of Claudette Colvin and made it difficult for those others who shared similarly constructed exclusions to effectively contest them at those intersections where race and gender and class are inseparable. The task of the critique of constitutive exclusion is, in this case especially, to unearth the memory that it could have been otherwise. The temporality that constitutive exclusion constructs is that of the teleological arc of history, though it may bend towards justice, it's still teleological, it's all going to work out in the end. In that what has happened must have happened, and this has led us to an homogeneous present determined by a fully present past. The critique of constitutive exclusion, as I have articulated it, calls this temporality into question, pointing out that the past is not yet finished, and the present is never entirely present to us. Insofar as the past is constructed through constitutive exclusion, its critique calls us to see that it could have been otherwise, and insofar as the present is constructed through constitutive exclusion, it calls us also to demand that it be otherwise. This insight is why the critique of constitutive exclusion is aligned with a materialist history. This is history as counter-memory, or history as critical genealogy. It is, in this sense, the radical history of the present. So you can choose either your Adornian Benjaminian sense of history or your Foucauldian sense of history. They're friends, I'm saying. Okay. The critique of constitutive exclusion, as constructive of political agency, acknowledges that political agency is never a successfully delimited field, that it produces the shadow of its own failure, and that no epistemology is proper to it, or that intelligible political agency can never itself be fully intelligible. Rather, the critique of constitutive exclusion calls us to remember that which we have actually never known. So that's sort of like a general description of what it is that I'm doing. I'm just going to take a few moments to draw out some implications or to talk a little bit more broadly about some other things that I do in the larger manuscript. So as I've already indicated, my book project explores several different aspects of constitutive exclusion, the specific negativity at work in it, and especially the political epistemology at work in the 4 different models of contesting exclusion. So first, Antigone, big surprise there, and her contestation of masculine sovereignty. Second, in the daughter of the biblical king Jephthah, whose self-sacrifice is so complete that she actually doesn't have a name. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this figure from the book of Judges in the Bible. Interestingly, the story of the sacrifice of Jephthah's daughter appears in each of the 3 major social contract theories, both in Hobbes and Locke and in Rousseau. No one has a sort of like history of thought kind of account of why that's the case, but it seems to indicate that in order to establish the terms of equality that social contract theory relies on, there has to be some kind of sacrifice of a virgin daughter. Because God says so don't mess around with that. All right, so the third case is Parks and Colvin, who I think we might know something about by now. And the 4th case, and this is the new stuff, is Diane Bond, who is a resident of Stateway Gardens housing project in its last years in Chicago. It's long since been torn down. Diane Bond sued the city of Chicago and the Chicago Police Department for brutality and for violation of her civil rights. Her story, along with the story of police impunity and the logics of abandonment of public housing, its ideals, or the idea of public housing, the actual buildings themselves, and the people who lived in them, that whole story is told in the essay Kicking the Pigeon by a citizen journalist in Chicago named Jamie Calvin. This last model, that of Diane Bond and the abandonment of public housing, is a hinge to open the question of constitutive exclusion out onto an examination of the sedimented materialist history I am aiming for, and in particular the epistemological organization of US cities by means of constitutive exclusion. Here under the guise of gentrification, in the broader sense indicated by Sarah Schulman in her 2012 book, A Gentrification of the Mind. It touches on a wide range of phenomena, including the use of sexual violence by police targeting women in public housing in Chicago, the rewriting of the political economy of cities through the use of tax increment finance schemes and enterprise zones, such as the President's New Promise Zones initiative, the use of riots as a form of political protest, and racism against queer youth of color and white gay gentrification, the Center on Halstead example that I spoke to. It looks at all of these different things in order to argue that the political life of the city and the ideal of political agency produced through the material organization of the city itself is structured through constitutive exclusion. This last model came to me through very quotidian experience, and that's me watching on my commute downtown to teach on the L train in Chicago, me watching the towers of Cabrini Green public housing complex being torn down a little bit each day. So it began with my realization that in some sense this was being done for me or for someone who fits like my demographic, like white, middle class or yuppie or whatever. I mean, I was a grad school, so I didn't have money, but I was going to soon, probably. So I came to understand that the city was sort of rewriting itself for me as the intended reader, right? I was the intended recipient of this narrative of the happy unity that the city was constructing. But all I could wonder was, what did we lose? What did we lose that we might never know about? And who are we as a result? Who might we become if we knew? So I'll just stop there. Thank you so much.